Before it became the economic center of the world, New York was little more than a small outpost known as New Amsterdam. The settlement was shaped by trade, conflict, forced labor, and harsh compromises between European powers and the Indigenous Lenape people, marks that remain embedded in the city's structure to this day. Today, with the help of AI technology, I'll take you back to 17th century New Amsterdam to observe how a city was formed under conditions like these. The 1835 oil painting by Robert Walter Weir, The Landing of Henry Hudson, 1609, at Verplanck Point, New York, captures a pivotal moment in the exploration of North America. It depicts the year 1609, when Henry Hudson led a voyage that brought Europeans deep into a river that would later bear his name. Along its banks lived the Lenape, who had long used the riverways and coastline as natural trade routes, linking communities across the region. In the years that followed, the Dutch presence became increasingly visible. In 1626, officials of the Dutch West India Company entered into an agreement recorded in history as the purchase of Manhattan for goods valued at around 60 guilders, roughly equivalent to 1,150 US dollars today. Although each side held very different understandings of land ownership, the transaction marked a crucial turning point. Manhattan became the foundation of a lasting European colony. The founding of New Amsterdam marked a significant moment in the establishment of a thriving trading center, sparking dynamic commercial exchange between Dutch settlers and the Lenape, the indigenous inhabitants of Manhattan. This period, vividly documented in historical illustrations, highlights the rapid rise of the fur trade as a cornerstone of Dutch economic activity in the New World. Skilled hunters with deep knowledge of the local environment, the Lenape traded valuable beaver pelts and other furs in exchange for European goods. These trading posts became focal points of economic and cultural exchange, laying the groundwork for the complex interactions that would shape the region's future. That same year, 1626, Fort Amsterdam was constructed at the southern tip of Manhattan. It was the colony's most important defensive structure, protecting the harbor while projecting the authority of the Dutch West India Company. More than a military installation, the fort also served as an administrative center, where commercial and political power converged during the colony's earliest years. In this early phase, New Amsterdam remained little more than a small outpost on the edge of the Atlantic world. Yet from its rough wooden wharves, modest dwellings, and unassuming fort, the foundations of a great city were laid. A city that would continue to evolve, expand, and absorb the conflicts of the modern world in the decades to come. As New Amsterdam began to take shape physically, social tensions quickly surfaced. The colony was not built on empty land, but on a landscape long shaped by the Lenape, by their settlements, trade networks, and spiritual ties to the land. Deep differences in how land, ownership, and exchange were understood led to prolonged friction, which frequently escalated into violence. By 1644, after years of bloody conflict, a series of fragile treaties were finally signed. These agreements did not resolve the underlying tensions, but they created a brief and necessary pause, allowing the colony to recover. New Amsterdam entered a period of relative calm, long enough to rebuild infrastructure, expand its harbor, and restore an economy repeatedly disrupted by warfare. At the same time, another social transformation was quietly reshaping the colony. From the mid-17th century onwards, slavery became an increasingly visible part of life in New Amsterdam. Africans were brought there by force, forming an essential labor base in farms, docks, and households. By 1655, their presence had become a permanent feature of the young city's economic and social structure. The urban space thus contained sharply divided layers of society: Dutch merchants, soldiers, free settlers, indigenous people pushed from their ancestral lands, and those deprived of their freedom all coexisted within a confined area. Streets, docks, and marketplaces were not only sites of trade, but arenas where power relationships were asserted and reinforced on a daily basis. During this period, New Amsterdam increasingly revealed its nature as a commercial colony, adaptable and diverse, yet deeply conflicted. Its prosperity depended on trade and labor, while social order rested on fragile compromises and profound inequalities. These conflicts were not temporary disruptions. They became part of the city's foundation, shaping how New Amsterdam would continue to grow, expand, and confront even greater upheavals in the decades that followed. Daily life in New Amsterdam unfolded within cramped, highly practical spaces. Most families lived in single-room dwellings built of timber or rough brick, with a brick hearth at the center of the home. Natural light was limited, and household items were typically made from wood, pewter, or simply forged iron. Every object served a basic purpose, reflecting a life with little room for excess. The daily rhythm began early. Each morning brought familiar, repetitive tasks: grinding grain, drawing water from wells or the river, mending nets, repairing boats, and preparing food to store for the long winter months. Men, women, and children all took part in labor in different ways. In such a young colony, the boundary between domestic space and working space was almost non-existent. The architecture of New Amsterdam bore a strong Dutch imprint. Houses featured steep gabled roofs, narrow facades, and brick walls facing the street. This design conserved space and suited the coastal climate. Over time, as English influence grew, new architectural elements began to appear, such as sliding windows and altered interior layouts, creating an urban landscape that was mixed in character, not yet fully shaped by a single identity. The streets of New Amsterdam were muddy and uneven. After rainfall, paths turned to thick sludge, while smells from the harbor, livestock enclosures, and household waste hung in the air. Yet it was within these harsh conditions that a community took form. Markets, churches, and wharves became gathering places where news was exchanged and social ties gradually developed. Everyday life in New Amsterdam lacked the grandeur of a major city. It was defined instead by labor, adaptation, and survival. From these small houses, muddy streets, and steady routines, an early urban society slowly emerged, laying the groundwork for the city's far greater transformation in the decades that followed. By the mid-17th century, New Amsterdam had become a stable commercial colony, but its hold on power remained fragile. In 1664, English warships appeared in the harbor, confronting the Dutch settlement with an unavoidable reality. There was no bombardment, no major fighting. New Amsterdam surrendered almost in silence. The colony was renamed New York, marking a transfer of power from the Dutch to the English that left no physical trace of war on the ground. This moment was more than a simple change of name. It reflected a shifting balance of power across the Atlantic, where European empires competed through naval strength, trade, and diplomacy. For local residents, the transition unfolded more quickly than it was fully felt. Laws, administrative language, and symbols of authority gradually changed, while everyday life continued much as before in markets, docks, and workshops. 3 years later, in 1667, the Treaty of Breda formally settled the dispute. The Dutch ceded New Netherland to England in exchange for strategic interests in Suriname. The decision was made in Europe, but its consequences were felt directly in the colony. New York entered a new political order, now more firmly tied to the governing system of the British Empire. Yet power in the city remained unsettled. In 1673, as war between England and the Netherlands resumed, the Dutch Navy briefly recaptured the city and renamed it New Orange. This return was largely symbolic rather than transformative. Just 1 year later, through diplomatic agreements, the city was handed back to England once again. This 10-year period reveals that New Amsterdam, or New York, was not merely a settlement, but a piece in a global contest. Power shifted not through direct violence, but through the presence of fleets, signatures on treaties, and decisions made thousands of miles away. For the city's inhabitants, each transfer of authority settled like a new layer laid over familiar daily life, signaling that the city was entering a different phase of development, broader in scope and more complex in character. In the closing decades of the 17th century, New York began to shed the form of a colonial outpost and emerge as a rapidly expanding port town. By around 1680, the city's population had surpassed 4,000. Economic life centered on the harbor, where goods from the interior and the Caribbean were gathered, before continuing their journey across the Atlantic. Along the banks of the East River, the Great Dock became the city's most important commercial gateway. Sugar, furs, and tobacco were unloaded here, injecting new energy into urban life. Wooden piers, warehouses, and ship repair yards rose shoulder to shoulder, turning the waterfront into a zone of constant labor, where the sounds of hammers, ropes, and voices mingled with the smell of salt air. Earlier, in 1653, Dutch settlers had constructed the wall that gave Wall Street its name. This defensive structure is described in an 1887 account by Augustine E. Costello, which highlights the early processes of urban planning and fortification in what would become New York City. The wall marked the northern boundary of New Amsterdam and reflected early efforts at both defense and spatial organization. Through Costello's historical lens, it stands as a strategic feature, simultaneously a protective measure and a physical edge of an expanding urban space, foreshadowing the city's later growth into a major metropolis. Near the harbor, the water gate served as a key checkpoint, controlling the movement of goods and people entering the city by river. Customs duties, paperwork, and access were regulated here, signaling the increasing complexity of the colonial administrative system. New York was no longer merely a place of trade. It was becoming a more tightly organized system designed to serve commerce and authority. By 1689, political upheavals in Europe quickly reverberated across the Atlantic. The effects of England's Glorious Revolution sparked the uprising led by Jacob Leisler, shaking the balance of power in New York. Although short-lived, the revolt exposed deep instability within colonial society, where authority was still being defined and contested. By the end of the century, Pearl Street had emerged as one of the city's busiest thoroughfares. Shops belonging to craftsmen and merchants lined the waterfront, serving the needs of an increasingly diverse population. Pearl Street clearly reflected New York's transformation from a small riverside settlement into a port city in the process of forming its own identity. By 1699, New York remained modest in scale compared with European cities, but its foundational structure was firmly in place. Population growth, expanding trade, emerging infrastructure, and visible political conflict all signaled that the city had entered a new phase, one that would prepare it to become a far more significant center in the century that followed. Looking back at the 17th century, New Amsterdam, and later New York, was not a story of a city born in glory, but of a slow, contested process shaped by contradiction and adaptation. From the forests, marshes, and trading routes of the Lenape, the area gradually became a European outpost, built through hard labor, fragile compromises, and decisions made far from these shores. The city grew amid conflict, temporary treaties, the introduction of slavery, and repeated transfers of power between European empires left deep marks on its emerging social structure. New Amsterdam was never a uniform space. It was a place where multiple communities, languages, and layers of authority coexisted within a narrow stretch of land by the water. By the end of the century, New York was beginning to take on the shape of a true port city. Its population increased, trade expanded, and infrastructure was built to regulate goods, people, and territory. Streets such as Pearl Street, the docks along the East River, and the defensive wall that would later become Wall Street were not only responses to immediate needs, but quiet forces shaping how the city would function in the future. What is striking is that many of the core traits of modern New York were already present at this early stage. A city oriented towards the sea, dependent on global trade, a diverse yet tense society, and an urban space where power, economics, and everyday life constantly collided. These historical layers did not disappear. They accumulated, forming the foundation for the city's explosive growth in the centuries that followed. Through AI reconstruction, we are not simply revisiting lost buildings or vanished streets. We are observing how a city takes shape through human choices, through ambition, fear, adaptation, and compromise. 17th century New York, though still small, already carried within it the seeds of a city that would go on to reshape the world for centuries to come.